Gods and eternity. Perhaps at this point it might be useful to make some clarifications. When we speak of the race of beings known as the Anunnaki, we have to understand a little of their characteristics, beginning with their lifespan. When we speak of God today, particularly in the West, we have a conception of a being that is eternal. In fact, the Christian faith teaching goes to the superlative in all areas. God is eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Eternal means no beginning nor end. Omnipotent is all-powerful. Omniscient is knowing everything at all times. And omnipresent is being everywhere at all times. And, when human beings first became self-aware, and aware of the Anunnaki, of course they called them gods. After all, they had created us. How could we as human beings know anything, other than the fact that we died, and the Anunnaki continued on? That is a practical definition of eternal. The addition of the other superlatives was quite practical as well. A God that had the power of creating life, even though it was eventually established that it was the remaking of an existing being, still might well be thought of as omnipotent. And the Anunnaki had other abilities as well, that defied the senses of the first human beings, like being able to fly around. That later expression we find in the Bible, the fear of the Lord, was quite justifiable even in reference to the Anunnaki. Omniscience is a small step to take in referring to the Anunnaki gods, because, once again, they had created human beings and had many magical and wonderful abilities. That they would have infinite knowledge would not be a stretch at all. It was later that the human race began to see just how much the gods were just like human beings. That, of course, is not surprising when we consider we have their DNA. Although we are not eternal or powerful, or wise like the gods, we eventually got caught up in the drama between them. Their fights with other gods, their jealousies and their wars. And we can see just how accurate that statement is from the book of Genesis. We were made in the image and likeness of the gods. Right up to the 21st century we are still at war with each other, and for the same reasons. This is how the pantheons of the Egyptians, Greeks and Romans came about. Today we are sometimes even amused at the way the gods are portrayed in the legends and mythologies because we have a higher view of God, a more rational, purified view of God. The one God. But what those people were mythologizing was, in fact, the Anunnaki gods as they really were. There is one other thing that we must consider when we think about the difference in longevity and life cycle of the Anunnaki. We do not have specific knowledge of the length of one day on the planet Nibiru. That is to say, we don't even know how that planet behaves and how the cycles of life are established. However, we do know, as we have already pointed out, the quick rotation of the Earth and the day-to-night cycle here was difficult for the Anunnaki to adjust to, in the beginning of their stay here. That would infer a much longer wake and sleep cycle on their own planet. We do have the record of one of the major complaints that the god Enlil had against the human race was that he was unable to get rest. Too much racket from the human beings. It does seem to me that the sleep cycle of the Anunnaki gods may well have been such that human beings dedicated to the service of one or other of the gods may not physically see or hear from their god for long periods of time, while the god slept. It is something to consider. Therefore the absentee god would not be unusual at all. And as we track history to the present day, the full spiritualizing of God, particularly in monotheism, would coincide well with the experience of the past, when the Anunnaki gods were not physically accessible to the people for long periods. One of the most important issues we will eventually delve into is this very change in the view of the gods that morphed eventually into monotheism. It is a fascinating subject, and I think it has once more to do with the Anunnaki, and one of them in particular. We will flesh this out later, but I am of the mind that Hermes, which I believe we can trace back to actually being Ningishzida, the wise one, son of Enki. That is my own personal view of the track, and I think he was a direct influence, as Hermes, on the transition to monotheism, for reasons we may not suspect at first. However, I will attempt to pull those threads together at a later point. There is one other question that springs naturally to mind. Where are the Anunnaki now? Why do we not see them? The short answer is that they got all the gold they needed to fix their atmosphere and they bailed out. When they first arrived here, that was their primary mission. The problem of humanity, their slave race, was a secondary problem they had created. In fact, the human race and what to do about us was one of the main sources of contention among the Anunnaki. Right from the beginning of our existence, the battles between the two famous brothers, Enlil and Enki, were centered around the wisdom of creating us as a race, and then, how intelligent and like the Anunnaki we would be. After the Great Cataclysm, when Enlil had hoped to solve the problem by letting us be obliterated, it was discovered that Enki had ensured our survival. From then it was decided to go all in with their creation, and the real battles began. But at the same time Ningishzida went to what is now South America, and discovered that the cataclysm had laid open the earth, and vast tracts of gold were right out in the open, ready for the taking. That simplified the rest of the mission for gold, and shortened the time span considerably. The time that passed from the end of the cataclysm some 11,500 years ago was just under 3 shars of their cycle. It is sometimes thought that the original event of 12,500 years ago was in part caused by, or at least catalyzed by, a particularly close passing of Nibiru. In other schools of thought, the timing of the Nibiru passing was closer to the second temperature spike event of 11,500 years ago, between which is that cold period we call the Younger Dryas. Whichever is true, 3 shars takes approximately 10,800 years. Other factors and historical references lead me to believe that the passing of Nibiru was at that earlier time of 12,500 years ago, and that would mean that the most recent passing was just around the time of the birth of Christ. That would quite possibly explain that bright star that was seen at the time, because Nibiru is a luminous planet and it comes right into our solar system. We know that the Anunnaki left in that period of time, and it is most likely they would do so when Nibiru was close by. That means, if and when they decide to return to this planet, it most likely will not happen for another roughly 1,500 years. What will be left of us is another question. For them it will have been 1 shar. For us it will have been 3.5 millennium. Those are some of the big picture questions on the very basic level. But they raise a multitude of other questions which we will look at in further posts.